A millionaire saw a woman give birth on the street. That moment, he decided to change her life forever. Hello, Noah's beloved family. This is Henry speaking to you today. Before we begin, I want to share something important. My brother Noah is going through a difficult time. His illness has returned, and he's now taking time to rest and heal. Though you won't hear his voice in this video, every word in this story was written by him, with the same heart, soul, and love he always gives to you. From now on, I'll be here to support him, to help carry the stories he continues to create for you. It's an honor to read for him, and I hope I can do his words justice. If you have a moment, please say a gentle prayer or send a kind thought for Noah, for strength, for healing, and for peace. He misses you all deeply. Also, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. How did the voice feel to you? Did it carry the story well? Your feedback means everything to us. Now let's begin. The door slammed behind Sophie Miller with a deafening thud, echoing like a silent verdict through the gray skies of Portland. Rain began to fall, sharp, cold drops that slid down her flushed cheeks, mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. She stood on the doorstep, no longer a doorstep to her home, with a small suitcase at her feet and trembling hands wrapped around her swollen belly. The baby kicked, as if to remind her the time had come. "You've already shamed this family enough." Her stepmother's sharp voice still echoed from inside. "Go run to that loser you chose and see where that gets you." Sophie turned her head, eyes searching for her father, the man who used to be her safe place. He sat at the dining table, pretending to read yesterday's newspaper, deliberately avoiding her gaze. "Dad, I have nowhere else to go. I'm in labor." Her voice cracked, her body curling in pain from a sudden contraction. Not a glance, not a word. He simply turned the page. The dry crackle of the newspaper was louder than any rejection. She understood. This was final. Sophie pulled her suitcase down the steps as the rain drenched her thin coat and soaked her shoes. Her hair clung to her face, her body freezing, but none of it compared to the icy ache of being discarded by her own family. Not knowing where to go, she walked, blindly following the familiar streets that now felt foreign and unforgiving. Neighbors closed their windows as she passed. A few pedestrians turned their heads. No one asked, no one helped. The contractions became stronger, closer. She had to pause, gripping lampposts to breathe, to survive each wave of pain. The rain didn't stop. It poured as if determined to wash her away completely. Eventually, her exhausted legs carried her to the entrance of a luxury high-rise in the heart of the city. Sophie looked up at the cold glass facade before her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the soaked sidewalk. She couldn't go on, couldn't? Another contraction tore through her body, forcing a scream from her lips, a cry for help lost in the storm. Inside, behind the tall glass walls of the lobby, a man stood frozen, watching her. He didn't know her name, but something in her face, so full of pain and despair, struck a place in him he hadn't touched in years. His name was Cris Pine, a successful architect who lived in the penthouse of that very building. He wasn't one to step out into chaos. But this time, he did. He pushed through the doors, ran into the rain toward the stranger writhing in pain on the concrete. While the security guard hesitated, Cris gave a single firm order. "Call an ambulance. She's in labor." The pain in Sophie's abdomen was unbearable. She curled up on the freezing sidewalk, her breath shallow, choked between the rhythmic fall of rain. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, her hair plastered to her face, her wide eyes filled with terror. She had never imagined bringing a child into the world like this, on the street, in the rain, alone. But she had no other choice. A hand touched her shoulder gently. Sophie lifted her head. A man was kneeling beside her, worry etched deep into his soaked face. His expensive suit was drenched, Without a word, he took off his jacket and gently draped it over her trembling body. "Take a deep breath. My name is Cris. What's yours?" His voice was calm, deep, firm, but soothing. "Sophie?" she gasped. "The baby? It's coming?" "An ambulance is on its way," Cris replied, knowing full well that in this storm it wouldn't arrive soon. But his eyes, warm, steady, made Sophie nod. She had to believe in someone, and right now he was all she had. Another contraction hit. Sophie cried out, her hand instinctively clenching around his. He didn't flinch. Instead, he held on tighter, anchoring her through the storm. "You're doing great. I'm right here. You're not alone," he whispered. Cris never imagined he'd one day be kneeling on a rain-soaked street in the middle of the night, delivering a stranger's child. Yet, in that moment, his heart beat louder than it had in 7 years. Memories of Marina, his wife, rushed back. Marina had died in a car crash while 6 months pregnant. He hadn't been there. He hadn't had a chance. But this time, he was here, and he would not fail. Sophie screamed. Her tears mixed with rain as the baby began to crown. Cris, trembling but focused, followed instinct, catching the child with both hands. A newborn cry pierced through the night, cutting clean through the heavy silence. "It's a boy," Cris said softly, tears welling up in his eyes. Carefully, he held the baby against his chest, shielding him from the rain with his body and coat. Sophie sobbed, out of pain, out of relief, out of sheer disbelief. "Is he okay? Please, my baby." "He's perfect," Cris said gently, placing the child on Sophie's chest. By the time the ambulance finally arrived, they found a man, soaked to the bone, filthy but glowing, kneeling beside a woman who looked exhausted but overjoyed. Amid the chaos, a miracle had taken place, and Cris knew in that moment 3 lives had become forever intertwined. And just like that, under flashing lights and sirens, Sophie and her newborn were swept into safety, carried away from the storm. Sophie woke under the pale glow of hospital lights. The first feeling was pain, deep, bone-tired exhaustion, but then panic. She turned her head quickly, heart pounding, until she saw Leo in a tiny bassinet beside her, swaddled tight, breathing peacefully, a soft, sleeping face. Tears spilled without warning. Her son was alive and safe. A nurse entered, clipboard in hand, and offered a warm smile. "Your little boy's a real fighter," she said. "You both made it through." "The man? Who helped me?" Sophie asked, her voice raspy. "He left a few hours ago, but he covered your hospital bill. His name was Cris Pine." Somewhere high above the city, Cris sat in silence by his window, still soaked, still shaking, his hands no longer building towers, but having caught life itself. Sophie blinked, stunned. He hadn't just caught her baby in the rain, he'd made sure she had nothing else to worry about. A stranger, no ties, no obligation. And yet, he had done more for her than anyone ever had. 2 days later, as she was discharged, the nurse handed her an envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper with an address in North Portland and a handwritten note. "Vacant unit, warm and safe. You can stay temporarily if you'd like. No pressure. CP." She took a cab, unsure of what she would find. The building was old but clean. Not fancy, just a single bed, a small fridge, a working stove, and a window that looked out over a bare winter courtyard. But when she laid Leo down in a makeshift crib of pillows and borrowed blankets, Sophie exhaled fully for the first time in weeks. No one was yelling here, no disapproving eyes, no slamming doors. This tiny room, plain and worn, made her feel something she had forgotten. Safe. That first night, Sophie barely slept. Leo woke often, crying from hunger, from cold, from unfamiliarity. She clumsily nursed him, humming lullabies she barely remembered from her own childhood. When he finally drifted off in her arms, she whispered, You'll have a different life. I promise. The next day, she walked to a corner market and bought just a few essentials. Money was tight, but she still grabbed flour and sugar, the only things that reminded her she still had a skill, a purpose. Baking, the last remaining skill from her biological mother. As night fell, the scent of sweet bread filled the little apartment, and in the midst of loss, exhaustion, and uncertainty, Sophie smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. Sitting by the small window, Sophie watched the rain fall quietly outside. Warm light glowed from the kitchen. The scent of sweet bread still lingered in the air, and Leo's soft breathing filled the room. It was a fragile kind of peace, but it was real. She never thought she'd survive that day, let alone find a place to begin again. There was no one beside her now, but no one was holding her back either. She clenched her hands gently. Hands that had once trembled with fear were slowly learning how to hold life again. Each loaf of bread, each sleepless night rocking her baby, each tiny step forward, was the heartbeat of a life that had nearly slipped away. And though the road ahead was still long, she knew. She was no longer the same girl who collapsed in the rain. Something was shifting. And that man, Cris Pine, would return soon, bringing with him a turning point she had no name for yet. Cris came back on a misty February morning. Sophie was hanging baby towels and tiny onesies on a makeshift clothesline strung between two chairs. When she heard the knock, her breath caught. She didn't know anyone around here. But when she opened the door, there he was. Tall frame, dark coat, and those quiet eyes. Somehow softer this time. "Sorry to drop in unannounced," Cris said, holding up 2 paper bags. "I brought some things. Formula, diapers, a few canned meals." Sophie paused, then stepped aside. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied simply. The tiny apartment seemed to shrink further as he stepped inside, but oddly, it felt warmer. Cris placed the bags on the table, his eyes scanning the room. The pillow crib, the unwashed bottles, the lingering scent of sweet bread. "You've still been baking?" he asked, a faint smile on his lips. "Yes. It's the only thing I do that still feels like me," Sophie said, clutching the edge of her shirt. Cris nodded. His gaze settled on Leo, fast asleep. There was something tender in his expression Sophie didn't expect, a gentleness she hadn't seen before. From then on, his visits became routine. Every time he brought exactly what she needed, even when she hadn't asked. One day it was vitamins, another day wet wipes, once a tiny stuffed bunny. He never stayed long, just enough to check in, ask how she was doing, then leave. But his presence, subtle, quiet, became something Sophie started to look forward to. One afternoon, Sophie brought her baked goods to a nearby park, hoping to sell a few. She set up a folding table, with Leo asleep in his stroller beside her. The scent of butter cookies and cinnamon filled the air. Passers-by stopped, smiled, sampled. For the first time in weeks, she felt hopeful. Then she looked up and saw Cris standing across the street, his expression hardening as he crossed quickly toward her. "What are you doing?" he asked, low but firm. "I'm working," she said, lifting her chin, "providing for my child." "In the wind? With a 1-month-old? Chris's voice tightened. "What if someone hurts you? What if it rains?" "Then I handle it," Sophie replied, steady, "because I'm his mother, and it's on me." They stood there, facing each other amid strangers and traffic. On one side, Chris's wordless fear. On the other, Sophie's growing sense of self. After a moment, Chris's tone softened. "I'm not against you working. I just don't want to see you struggle like this." Sophie stilled. For the first time, he wasn't instructing. He wasn't commanding. He was simply concerned. "So how do you plan to help me?" she asked, eyes locked on his. He hesitated. Then he said, "I know a few bakeries. A couple of places might be looking for someone like you. If you'd let me, I can make introductions." They didn't speak for 2 days after that. Sophie felt she'd been too harsh. She knew Cris was only worried, and his reaction, though controlling, came from care. But the instinct of a new mother, hurt too many times before, made her push back. She didn't want to be seen as someone who just received. She didn't want to look weak. Cris, on his end, was unsettled. He was used to being in control of projects, timelines, emotions. But Sophie wasn't a problem to be solved. She had her own kind of strength, quiet but unshakable, and that, perhaps, was exactly what drew him in, though he hadn't admitted it yet. On the third day, he came back. Sophie was sitting on the porch steps, cradling a sleeping Leo. "Are you mad at me?" he asked, no pretense. "No, I don't want you thinking I can't stand on my own," she replied. Cris sat beside her. "I've never thought that, but even strong people need rest sometimes. I want you to know, you don't have to do it all alone." The wind passed softly between them. Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. They sat there for a long time, and in that silence, easy, unforced, they both realized they weren't strangers anymore. It was becoming something else. The following week, Cris returned on a Thursday afternoon, not with groceries or baby supplies, but with a business card and a faint, knowing smile. "My friend Nate owns a coffee shop in the Pearl District," Cris said, placing the card on the table. "They're looking for someone who can bake, with real handcrafted flavor. I brought him some of your cookies last week." Sophie stared, wide-eyed. The card might as well have been glowing. "You brought my cookies without telling me?" Cris shrugged slightly, sheepish. "I wasn't sure you'd feel ready, but Nate was sure you had something special." The next day, Sophie visited the cafe with Cris. The space was cozy, filled with the scent of roasted beans and fresh bread. Nate, a warm, open man, shook Sophie's hand with both of his. "I heard you're the magician behind the cookies that made me feel like my grandma was still alive," he grinned. They all laughed. The interview was short and easygoing. Within 20 minutes, Sophie had her first job in months. From that week on, Sophie woke before dawn, got Leo ready, and dropped him off at a daycare near the shop, something Cris had discreetly arranged. She worked in the kitchen, kneading dough, watching oven timers, tasting each batch like it was her way of telling the world who she was. She stumbled at first, but after a few weeks, Sophie's instincts returned. She came home covered in flour, exhausted but bright-eyed. She started bringing home her first paychecks, small but hers. Leo grew, laughed more, recognized her the moment she walked in. Every hug, every sleepy snuggle at the end of a long shift reminded Sophie she was on the right path. Cris still visited, but no longer as a helper. He became someone who shared in her joy, who listened to stories about burnt muffins, new recipes, or how Leo had started rolling over early. They no longer kept their distance. Slowly but surely, they were becoming part of each other's lives. One evening, while folding Leo's onesies, Sophie asked softly, almost to herself, "Why are you doing all this for me?" Cris hesitated. Then he said, quietly but clearly, "Because you deserve it, and because I want to see you, not just survive, but shine." Sophie didn't respond, but something shifted inside her, not fear this time, but trust, and a gentle warmth she hadn't felt in years. She once believed she could only survive, but now she was truly living, working, raising her son, standing on her own. And beside her stood a man, no promises, no demands, but always there, a quiet kind of strength. She didn't say it out loud, but for the first time, when Cris got up to leave, she smiled and said, "Drive safe, okay?" And for Cris, those simple words meant everything. One evening, after Sophie finished bathing Leo, Cris was still sitting in the living room. He had just finished playing with the baby and now looked around the small apartment. A simple space, but undeniably warm. "What are you thinking?" Sophie asked, drying Leo's hair and settling him into the crib. "I'm thinking. It all started in the rain," Cris said quietly. "And now, look at you, working, raising your son, doing it all. And I can't stop thinking how many women out there are just like you, but no one helps them." Sophie looked up. There was something in Chris's voice, not admiration, but concern, deep, genuine concern. "I want to build something," he said, "a place, an organization for single mothers, a support network with housing, therapy, job training, not out of pity, but out of respect. No one should give birth on a sidewalk and be forgotten the next day. Not in this city, not anymore." Sophie stared at him. "You mean a charity?" "No," Cris replied. "A real movement. I want to call it Haven Roots, a place to begin again, but with something to hold on to." She was silent for a long moment before exhaling. "That's a big idea. And I don't want you to be just someone it helps," Cris said, his voice firm. "I want you to help build it, as a co-founder, with me." Sophie froze. She never imagined herself, once cast out into the rain, being invited to build something for others. "You're sure?" she whispered. "I'm sure. You understand them in ways I never will, because you've been there." She didn't have the words yet, but something lit up inside her, a quiet ignition. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just someone who needed help. She was someone who could help change the world. From their clumsy first encounters, Cris and Sophie gradually became an inseparable part of each other's lives. Their partnership at Haven Roots turned into something more. Cris would stop by after work, bring dinner, fix a broken shelf, or rock Leo to sleep. Every little act, every glance, every shared laugh. Slowly, a quiet connection deepened between two people once shattered by life. They spoke of dreams. Sophie shared her long-lost desire to become a professional baker, to open a cozy corner bakery that always smelled of warm bread and echoed with children's laughter. Cris, a man once consumed by deadlines and high-rise meetings, simply smiled. "I just wish for a place where I don't have to keep running." One afternoon, as golden light painted the rooftops, Cris gently asked if she'd return with him to the rooftop where everything began, the place where Sophie gave birth to Leo in the middle of a raging storm. Now the sky was clear, the breeze soft, the city somehow gentler than before. Sophie stood still, cradling Leo, looking down at the street below. "I thought I would die here that night," she whispered, "cold, alone, in pain, with nothing left." "And I was standing right there," Cris nodded toward the railing, not knowing what I was doing, just knowing that if I walked away, I'd regret it forever. Sophie turned to him. "But you didn't walk away." "Because I saw you, not just someone who needed help, but someone I couldn't bear to leave behind." Silence stretched between them, full of meaning. Leo slept peacefully against Sophie's shoulder, his little breaths like a silent blessing. "I'm scared," Sophie murmured. "Scared that if I let myself feel, it'll all fall apart again." "I'm scared too," Cris admitted. "I had everything, then lost it all. But with you, I don't think about what I've lost. I only know that I'm alive." The sunset spilled its orange hue over her hair. A breeze lifted a strand across her cheek, and Cris gently brushed it aside. His gaze lingered. And then, without another word, they leaned in, kissing softly, unhurried, without expectations. Just two wounded hearts meeting in a moment where time itself seemed to hold its breath. In that golden light, they were no longer strangers thrown together by a storm. They were two souls finding their way back to life, through each other. After that kiss beneath the sunset, everything between Sophie and Cris quietly shifted. There were no grand declarations, no titles needed, only the soft certainty that they had found home in each other. But that bond did more than heal their hearts. It inspired something greater, a shared purpose to build a place for women who had endured what Sophie once had. And so, Haven Roots was born, a place to begin again, where no one had to walk alone. In just 6 months since its founding, Haven Roots had become a real beginning for dozens of single mothers. The small community house tucked on a Portland corner now echoed with the laughter of children and the quiet strength of women relearning how to live, love, and believe in themselves again. Sophie wasn't just a co-founder. She was the heart of the organization. She remembered every child's name, listened to every story, and taught weekly baking classes for mothers just like her. Cris took care of operations, fundraising, and partnerships. They were no longer connected by chance. They were united by purpose. Eventually, when life found its rhythm, they moved in together into a small house in the suburbs. It had a vegetable garden, a wooden porch swing, and a kitchen that always smelled like home. Leo grew up surrounded by unwavering love. He called her Mama, called Cris Mr. Cris. Then one day he simply said, Daddy. One rainy afternoon, after finishing her shift at the cafe, Sophie stepped out in a light coat, a box of pastries in hand. And there Cris stood, on the same corner where he once gave her a business card, soaked from the rain but unmoving. Dressed in a dark suit, he dropped to one knee, right there on the wet sidewalk, in the middle of traffic and puddles, and held up a small velvet box. I met you in the rain. I loved you through sun and storms. Let me walk with you through all the seasons ahead. Will you marry me? Tears rolled down Sophie's cheeks. She couldn't speak. She only nodded, hard, before pulling Cris into an embrace beneath the softest rain that ever fell. They married in spring, in the same community garden where Haven Roots once hosted its first family picnic. There was no grand dress, no lavish reception, just wildflowers, wooden benches, homemade cake, and the people who had witnessed their journey from broken to whole. Leo ran down the aisle holding the rings. The garden filled with laughter. Cris looked at Sophie, gripping her hand. This is family, he whispered. It was raining again. From the window of their cozy little home filled with laughter and the scent of fresh bread, Sophie watched raindrops slide down the glass. But this rain was no longer the bitter reminder of a desperate past. Today, it played like a gentle melody, an echo of something miraculous. She placed her hand on the misted pane, and through it, the blurred image of Leo chasing butterflies in the backyard slowly came into view. His curly brown hair bounced as he ran, his bright eyes shining with joy under the golden sun. Rain and sunlight danced together, making the garden shimmer like magic. Sophie smiled. Memories came rushing back like an old film reel. That cold sidewalk where Leo was born. Chris's warm, steady hands. Sleepless nights rocking her baby. Early mornings baking sweet bread by candlelight. And then, that rain-soaked proposal. A journey that once seemed impossible, yet she had lived every step of it. She stepped out onto the porch where Cris was placing a new pot of flowers. Their eyes met. No words needed. A simple nod, soft and knowing, was enough. They had made it through. Sophie knelt beside Leo, wrapping him in her arms, pressing her cheek against his sun-warmed hair. You know, sweetheart, she whispered, this house will always be a safe place for anyone who needs to start again. Because the greatest miracle isn't just surviving the storm, it's becoming someone else's shelter in the next one. The rain fell quietly, sinking into the earth, feeding the roots of their garden, just as love had filled the cracks inside Sophie's heart, slowly healing what once felt broken. Cris sat on the old wooden bench at the far end of the garden, cradling a steaming cup of tea. He looked ahead, watching Sophie and Leo playing beneath the soft rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. His son's laughter, the gentle voice of the woman he loved, these sounds stitched together the torn pieces of his past, wounds he once thought would never heal. He remembered that first night vividly, seeing Sophie in pain, collapsed on the cold sidewalk. Her trembling hand had clutched his, eyes begging not for pity, but for someone to stay. That moment, he'd made a silent promise. This time, I won't walk away. Cris had lost everything in an instant, his wife, their unborn child, even himself. But Sophie and Leo brought him back from that abyss, not with grand gestures, but with steady kindness, quiet trust, and the kind of love that asked for nothing in return. Now, every morning spent waking up beside them felt like a miracle. Each laugh from Leo was a reminder that life, despite all its cruelty, still offered second chances, if one dared to believe again. He rose from the bench and walked toward them, wrapping both Sophie and Leo in his arms. "We're lucky," he whispered. Sophie nodded, her eyes shining. "And maybe, someday we'll be someone else's luck too, on a rainy day, just like ours." They walked back inside, hand in hand, leaving behind the rain-kissed garden where miracles once began. It wasn't an ending, just a different kind of beginning, softer, steadier, and this time they were walking it together as a family.